I've no idea how long it takes, and knowing me, I'll rush it and we'll be early.
Okay, but I'll let you know.
I'm pretty sure she did it in 40 minutes last time, and I've given it 45, so it should be all right. I'll try and pay attention, but I said I'll try and pay attention, but I might be fully absorbed. I don't know how I'll rush it though. I don't know how I'll rush it because it's a script. But I think she read it and it took about 40 minutes, and I read it. I think I'm going to do it in less than half an hour because I can't.
She was surprised.
Welcome. We're going to tell a story to ourselves, from ourselves, a story of mud. We're going to tell a story, a material story, a story of matter, a story that matters, of this place, in this place. This is a story from time, of time, and in this time. We are infinite numbers of tiny particles, an admixture of mineral, water, and air. Difficult to define, difficult to contain. Merging and mixing between stone, mud, earth, clay, soil. Shifting our composition from place to place. In a time of our own, we are an immense geological clock. We are many, and we are one. We are mud. In this place, we are over 510 million years old, the age of rock. In this time before human time, a time of becoming stone, we are mud and silt. By our slow action of sludgy sedimentation, silty, salty, heavy and saturated, our steady pressure, squeezing out water. We form rocks as deep and thick as mountains. We create a continent whose edge ran just north of here, encircling an enormous basin. We are underwater in an oceanic world of meter-long sea scorpions. "430 million years ago, rivers and floods carry our friends, rocks, gravel and silt, from the almost barren, rocky land to settle on the floor of this shallow, sludgy basin. Occasionally, every decade or so, because this is the slow time of minerals, they gush in vast sedimentated quantities over the submarine cliff into the deeper basin. And together we fan out to form hundreds of layers of stone, sand and mud. Our finest particles, silt and mud, travel the furthest. And layer by layer, over millennia of time and the sustained and incremental pressure of our own weight, we form layers of mudstone, hundreds of meters thick. My friends, rocks, gravel and silt. Choose a stone and lay it on another. Wait till everyone has had their turn. Wasn't meant to say that bit. During the next few million years, movements of the earth crust compress, lift, and fold our horizontal layers, leaving some of us vertical or even turned right over. Through these movements, we can create mountains. Two million years ago, it gets very cold. Ice moves in glacial time, pushing us incrementally, gritting, grazing with friction, so that eventually we are deposited as mudstone roads that stretch out into the lost land of Maesgwyddno. 20 miles west of the rocks we now call Borth, 10 miles away. In Gwyddno's lost land, we were moist and rich, but fertile only for a time. The loss of this land is the story of Cantregaelod. They say an acre of Gwyddno's fertile soil land was worth 4 acres elsewhere, but it relied on a dike to protect it from the sea, and a fairy priestess guarded its sluicey gates. One day she was distracted by a courtier. A storm approached, and she failed to notice it. The sea rushed in to flood the land, and 16 villages were drowned. Gwyddno and the followers were forced to leave their fertile soil and seek a living in the higher, rocky, barren uplands. In Abu Dhabi and Borth, just 10 miles away, they say that if you listen closely, you can hear the bells of Cantregaelod ringing out. As they toll, they tell us of life and death, sea and soil, remembering and reminding us how this tale of inundation might be resonant today. 29,000 years ago, south of here, on the Gower Peninsula, we yield, shift and crumble as early humans from a semi-nomadic tribe dig into our skin, our soil, with sharp stones. Deep down, they find red earth. Príd goch, our earth blood. Without ochre, they make marks on the caves, where they take shelter from harsh, cold winds. Between finger and stone, we conjure events, thoughts and dreams on the walls of the cave. Our colour doesn't fade. So as we define the sacred space of shelter with marks and symbols across millennia and across generations, we remember the first acts of human dwelling. We become medium of the human imagination, carrying thought to reality, reality to spirit. These nomads see that the colour of our earth blood matches theirs, their lifeblood. So we, in their hands, skin to skin, smear our earth magic into their bodies too to protect them from danger. Smudging and blurring between skin and mudskin, we become them and they become us. These nomads see that the colour of our earth blood matches their lifeblood, so we in their hands, skin to skin, smear our earth magic onto their bodies too to protect them from danger. When one of the nomads party, a 21-year-old, dies suddenly between warm hand and cold skin, we smear our colour onto his body. Our earthy pigment guides the young man's spirit in its transition from this realm to the next. And the diminished party begin to dig again, this time to bury the young man in an earth limestone cave. We receive his body, his bones, and we preserve them. Thousands of years later, in 1823, when a geologist digs into our layers of time and stone, we reveal the young man's bones, how now deep with our ochre. Our ochre earth magic speaks across time. In a twist of translation, the geologist calls the young man the Red Lady of Paviland. She lifted from our earth archive, is then buried in the archive of a museum because her bones are the oldest human remains discovered in Wales. 2,500 years ago, a family of tribespeople begin to settle on a hill nearby in a place called Towsan. They dig into our moist soil skin to grow oats. They find that under these oats, our fleshy earth sticks to their skin. They dig not just for crops, but for our clay. They need containers for seeds, for harvested foods to be stored, and for transporting water. And so they shape us, and mould us, and knead us, and roll us into pots and urns and basins and bowls. The tribespeople see their own bodies in the curved vessels we make as our fleshy clay becomes body. As we become them, they become us. They put us into pots and pits, and with fire we harden. Earth meets ash. When elders of the tribe die, they use our pot bodies for their ashes, and our earth meets ash again. As the tribes fire their pots, they notice red-hot substance oozing from our dug-out depths, and over generations they learn how to shape this, our liquid of earth fire, as it cools into hardness, making sharper tools to dig into our earthy skin. These tools that came from our oars increased their crop. And our cultivation, the cultivation of mud to earth, marks the tribespeople's cultivation too, their culture. This culture came from us, of us, with us in this place. People make culture with matter. These tribes live on high, defensible land, for they claim it as us as theirs, their home turf. Each household's plot measures 30 paces by 60 paces, as much land as can be easily ploughed in a single day. And they describe this as their territory, ploughing and digging, making giant pattern tattoo across our surface. We remember these acts of dwelling in our mounds and our ridges. As these slowly earth-cultured people slice furrows in our surface, they form a new relationship with us and each other. Our surface is hard. It does not yield without force, so the resources for ploughing are not within the means of a single household. So households combine and begin to plough together. Cultivation becomes communal, and turf wars start to diminish. We make culture together. We form walls and floors for these tribal households. Following the upward patting and smoothing of human hands, we rise up to form walls, squeezing between wattle, mixing with straw, and sticking and joining with the soil of cattle. We earthy walls draw circular, seasonal patterns of dwelling into the earth, echoing the patterns of the sun and the stars. These arcs of boundary around the households bear religious and social meaning. But human enemies, storms, wind and rain, threaten to breach our little boundaries, and if our muddy defences are destroyed, they are rebuilt in a form of ceremony. 400 years ago, after claims to this land, our soil, by a succession of invaders, this land of free folk is now called Wales. But our fertile soils have been enclosed by the rich and divided up between generations and generations of sons, leaving some people landless and poor. The poor are left no choice but to illegally squat on remote, desolate, barren land. Poor young farm labourers, Hugh and Gwen, from Nimachantlaeth, decide to build a house. They have no land and no money, but by folklore they have rights to claim a plot of common land as far as they can throw an axe in 4 directions, if only they can build a house there under the cloak of darkness of one night and have smoke coming out of the chimney by dawn. They have already helped some of their friends build houses overnight at Enos, so they know how to look for a site with clean water and materials for building, turf, reeds, rush and earth. They wait until the time is right, when the swallows make their nests. It needs to balance the weather with the need for the longest possible stretch of darkness. As dusk falls on the night of the build, a small team meets secretly out on a hillock, and Hugh and Gwen lead them to the site. Some set to work quickly while the others keep a lookout. Spirits are high because there is something of a social event going on. Yet the materials available are limited. Timber and stone are scarce and distant, and so we, the earth, make the walls and the roof. Bound by moorland grass, as turf, we offer a medium that is readily available and quick to build, one that will wear well in the severe weather of the uplands. About 1/4 of an acre of our turf yields enough for Hugh and Gwen's house. As walls, we stack, and of roofs, we rest heavy on a timber frame, lying course by course, starting on the eaves, which partly cover the next. with only our wiry hair of moorland grass visible as our turf hair continues to grow, we, a living roof, will shed the windy wetness of upland Wales. Hugh knew how to cut us into roof when the grass was dry enough to be as tough as wire. This embodied knowledge, calibrated by story, place and culture, is measured by metaphor. Passed orally through generations, it relies on a continued practice through which folk and earth perform their physical and spiritual connection. When the turf house is roofed in the early hours of the morning, food is brought. It's nearly dawn. I think you might have to get a move on, builders. Just before dawn, food is brought to share with the helpers, and the workers scatter. A peat fire is set on the new hearth, and smoke unfurls from the chimney in the morning air. Earth meets ash again. Now that they have secured their turf in time, they will build a second, more permanent house on this same plot. Around 10 years later, again we rise to form Hugh and Gwen's walls, but this time as earth rather than turf. Abundant and local, we the earth are the mainstay of local construction, for stone is far away, difficult to transport and requires more people to build, and timber is scarce. Gwen and Hugh begin building in April. They've carefully watched their fellow builders, the birds, and according to Welsh law, the best time for building is when the swallow makes its nest, when the days are long and the sun warm to help dry and harden us, the earth. It's also when the trash, the vegetable material used to bind us into mud walls, is still green. As Gwen and Hugh's stamping feet above us echo their parents before them, with each stamp, we mix and merge earth to grit to sand to clay. More clogged feet above are built with 3-person gang, 2 to mix and pass up, and 1 to pack us down on the wall with their feet. Starting with about 20 inches of pure clay at the ground, to deter rats' claws, we pile and rise and pile. Squeezing and squashing and sticking and holding water, Gwen and Hugh follow the local method adapted for the damp weather around here, laying us in courses without formwork. This leaves us wet and only lightly compressed, so it takes days and sometimes weeks of resting under our own load in the wind and the slow baking of the sun before we dry. Finally, we come back to rock again, massive walls and very, very thick, tapering towards the eaves and rounded at the corners. We provide a hard floor too. Gwen knows that properly made and looked after, a mud floor will last for years, longer than a flag floor. In fact, a mud floor will be improved by the persistent damp around these parts. Their recipe is 4 barrowfuls of earth, a bucket and a half of lime, and a barrowful of cow dung. With a gang of friends, they slop us down and beat us. We spread and shift, compress and flatten until we're about hand length thick and as flat as a pancake, literally floored. When Hugh and Gwen walk and stamp over us with their special pair of clogs, a neighbour recommends driving sheep through the house to trample the floor, but Hugh and Gwen aren't convinced. As we harden gradually over 6 to 8 weeks, we're prone to cracks, so they wet us and smooth us often. Their final touch is to wash us with ox blood from neighbouring farms. to make us shine. Ding. Hugh and Gwen take pride in cleaning and decorating our flattened surface weekly with a rubbing stone, making patterns traditional to the area. We remember the material enchantment of rubbed pattern and colour in the cave on the floor. And even as Hugh and Gwen's neighbours begin to build houses with stone, we provide not only mortar, but colour for walls, a blood-red ochre that recalls caves and pots. Houses become bodies, vessels for love, magic and dreams. But slowly, our earthy ochre gives way to white, as pride gives way to misplaced morality and fear of our dirty magic. We elicit grubby and threatening. We have political agency. The rich deride us, and peasants seek to hide us, covering us with white to separate us from their touch. This Wales-wide whitewash forms a new culture, but hides the culture of building that came from our soil, from this place, a culture of earth defined by weather, climate, and geology. It hides our rocky beginnings in the Silurian. White hides the way our culture of building is contained by the rim of our ancient mountains. White hides the way mud moulded our culture and their homes once grew out of their soil. Pride, morality, and a lost connection mean that mud culture, our culture, becomes slowly forgotten, its metaphors and stories lost. So when 20 years ago a local man inherits the land Hugh and Gwen once claimed, he covers us, the earthen walls of Hugh and Gwen's cottage, with cement render, in the hope of shoring up an old shed against the elements. Oh dear. Unwittingly he starved us of air, and we increasingly took on the damp, the old knowledge about mud gone to the grave with Di's grandparents. So now we earthen walls have crumbled into curious mixed forms. Di is gradually destroying the cottage because he's found that our crumbs form the richest of manures. Meanwhile, with people and machine, we are building new earth knowledge. We are coming back to ourselves and back to the earth. 12 years ago, Pat Bora and David Lee designed and built this earthen drum. But how will our story of mud, our story with mud, continue? And what does it mean? We've mixed and mingled, buried and dug, preserved and revealed, moulded and daubed, built and remembered, shifted shapes and shared recipes. Through performing our relationship with mud through process, we've enchanted with mud in this sacred space. We've shown how mud is vital and has agency, how we make culture with mud and with matter, and that matters. How to survive the coming bad years. We need to remember the ways we can talk, not about or even to materials, but with materials. We need to remember ways to think, act, measure and build with metaphor of materials, with their stories, because their stories are much, much bigger than you or me, and our stories depend on their stories. Thank you, friends. I'm now stepping out of Welsh Lady Future into Louise Helstrap, and I'd like to say a massive thank you to Zoe Quick, who wrote this and unfortunately can't be here, and Kirsten McIver, who's just about to sneak out the door. So how many minutes have I got? 10 minutes, okay. So if I can just say a little bit about what's just happened, before I give you a couple of minutes of reflection time. This is taught on the MSc at CAT. This is one of our lectures, and therefore has a whole list of scientific references to back it up. And it stems from Zoe's interest in how, as you've probably heard, all the culture and the materials culture and telling the story of Earth from Earth's perspective. Where am I going? I think I'm going back now, am I? So I'm winging it a bit here because obviously I'm standing in. But basically, we're trying to give this material a voice and use this story as a mean to understand in a different way, not the usual chalk and talk that you often hear when you're sitting listening to stories of Earth. We get the very quantitative rather than the qualitative. So on that note, I think I'm going to finish and allow everyone to just sit and maybe build and maybe think about what's just happened and have a chat with your neighbour about it for the next couple of minutes, if that's okay.